The thunder of hooves against dry earth came to an abrupt halt as Jackson Newell yanked back on the reins, his weathered face tightening at the sight of the small wooden cross marking a fresh grave on the hillside. It was 1876, and the western frontier of Colorado was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Jackson had ridden 40 miles without rest, only to discover he was too late. His brother's funeral had concluded hours earlier, leaving nothing but the sound of wind rustling through prairie grass and the distant call of a lone hawk. "Damn it all," he muttered, removing his hat as he dismounted. His boots kicked up dust that swirled around him like ghosts as he approached the crude marker. At 32, Jackson had seen his share of death, but family was different. Family was supposed to endure. The town of Silver Creek sat nestled in the valley below, a collection of wooden structures that had sprung from nothing just a decade earlier when silver was discovered in the surrounding mountains. Jackson hadn't visited in years, preferring the open range to the confines of civilization, but his brother's telegram had drawn him back. Too bad he'd waited too long to respond. Jackson knelt by the grave, calloused fingers tracing the rough carved name. Thomas Newell, 1840–1876. No flowery words, no scripture, just a name and dates. It suited his brother, a man of few words himself. "I should have come sooner," Jackson said to the empty air. The reply was silence, broken only by his horse snorting impatiently. The sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged mountain peaks when Jackson finally stood. There was nothing to be done now except handle his brother's affairs and then return to the cattle drive. His foreman could manage without him for a few days, but not much longer. Cattle didn't wait for a man's grief. As he rode into Silver Creek, the activity of a Saturday evening greeted him. Piano music spilled from the saloon, mingling with boisterous laughter. A group of children chased each other between buildings despite their mothers' calls to come inside for supper. Normal life, uninterrupted by his personal loss. The Silvertip Hotel stood at the town center, its facade recently painted and boasting actual glass windows, a sign of Silver Creek's prosperity. Jackson secured his horse at the hitching post and dragged his weary body inside. The lobby was modest but clean, with a polished wooden counter and a small sitting area. A woman stood with her back to him, arranging ledgers on a shelf. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her blue dress simple but well-tailored. "Need a room for the night," Jackson said, dropping his saddlebags on the floor beside him. "Whatever's cheapest." The woman turned, and Jackson felt an unexpected jolt. Her eyes were the color of summer sage, set in a face that possessed a quiet beauty not flashy like the saloon girls, but the kind that lingered in a man's thoughts. "You must be Jackson," she said, her voice carrying a hint of surprise. "Thomas said you might come, though we'd nearly given up hope." Jackson stiffened. "You knew my brother?" "I'm Lillian Morrison," she replied, extending her hand. "I've been managing your brother's affairs since he fell ill. The doctor and I tried to make him comfortable at the end." Jackson reluctantly shook her hand, noting its softness against his hardened palm. "Appreciate what you did for him, madam, but I'm here now. I'll settle his debts and be on my way." A flicker of something disappointment perhaps crossed her features. "There's more to it than that, Mr. Newell. Your brother left the hotel to you." Jackson stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "That can't be right. Thomas was just the handyman here." Lillian shook her head. "He became part owner 2 years ago when Mr. Hollister couldn't pay him wages during a slow season. When Mr. Hollister passed last winter, Thomas inherited the rest. He worked hard to make this place respectable." Her chin lifted slightly. "And I've helped him every step of the way." "Well, I don't want it," Jackson said flatly. "I'm no hotel keeper. I'll sell it and be done." Her expression cooled. "Perhaps you should at least look at the books before making such a decision. Thomas was very proud of what he built here." Jackson frowned. The Thomas he remembered had been a drifter like himself, never settling in one place for long. The idea that his brother had put down roots, created something lasting, struck him as almost impossible to believe. "I'll look at whatever you want, Miss Morrison, but my mind's made up. I belong on the open range, not cooped up in town playing innkeeper." Lillian's smile didn't reach her eyes. Room 4 is available. It has a view of the mountains. Thomas always said it was the best room in the house. She handed him a key. Supper's at 6 in the dining room if you're interested. Jackson took the key, oddly unsettled by her formal tone. Much obliged. Your brother's personal effects are in his office, she added. I've organized everything, but there are some letters you might want to see. Thomas wasn't one for writing, Jackson replied. People change, Mr. Newell, Lillian said quietly. Sometimes in ways that surprise us. As she turned away, Jackson couldn't help but notice the graceful curve of her neck, the way her skirt swished softly as she moved. He quickly looked away, reminding himself he had no business noticing such things about a woman he'd just met, especially one who seemed determined to complicate his already complicated situation. The room was simple but comfortable, with a real mattress instead of the straw ticking he was accustomed to on the trail. After washing trail dust from his face and changing his shirt, Jackson found himself drawn to the small office Lillian had mentioned. Thomas's office was neat as a pin, with everything in its place so unlike the brother Jackson remembered. A roll-top desk dominated the small room, its surface clear except for a leather-bound ledger and a stack of envelopes tied with string. Jackson ran his fingers over the ledger, then picked up the bundle of letters. To his surprise, they were all addressed in his brother's distinctive scrawl, but none had been mailed. Opening the first, dated nearly a year ago, Jackson began to read, Dear Jackson, I reckon you'll be surprised to get a letter from me after all these years. Truth is, I never was much for writing, but things have changed. I've changed. I've built something here in Silver Creek, something I'm proud of. Jackson sank into the chair, reading letter after letter, none of which had ever been sent. In them, Thomas described his life in Silver Creek, the challenges of running the hotel, and increasingly, his admiration for Miss Lillian, who'd come west to teach school but had become his right hand at the Silvertip instead. The last letter, dated just 3 weeks earlier, was shaky but legible. Brother, the doctor says what ails me is serious. I may not have much time. I wish you could see what I've built here. I wish you could meet Lillian. She's been a blessing beyond words, though I never found the courage to tell her how I truly felt. Perhaps you'll deliver these letters yourself someday. Perhaps by then it will be too late for regrets. Jackson set the letters down, a heaviness settling in his chest. His brother, a man who had never put pen to paper if he could avoid it, had filled pages with words meant only for him, words that had never been sent. A soft knock at the door startled him. Lillian stood in the doorway, her expression hesitant. Supper's ready, she said. I thought you might want to join us. Some of the regular boarders would like to meet Thomas's brother. Jackson nodded, carefully retying the bundle of letters. I'd be obliged, Miss Morrison. As he followed her to the dining room, Jackson found himself studying her more closely. Was this the woman his brother had admired from afar? The woman who had inspired a lifetime non-writer to fill pages with his thoughts? Jackson couldn't blame him. There was something compelling about Lillian Morrison, something that went beyond her physical appearance. The dining room buzzed with the conversation of half a dozen guests seated around a long oak table. Conversation faltered as Jackson entered, curious eyes assessing him. Everyone, this is Jackson Newell, Thomas's brother, Lillian announced, gesturing for him to take the empty chair at the head of the table. A gray-haired man with spectacles nodded solemnly. Your brother was a good man, sir. This town's poorer without him. He certainly kept this place running smoothly, added a woman in a high-necked dress that marked her as respectable. Miss Lillian's been managing admirably, of course, but we've all felt his absence. Jackson nodded awkwardly, unused to such social situations after years of eating around campfires with other cowhands. I appreciate that. Seems Thomas found a good home here. He made it, Lillian corrected softly as she took her seat beside him. This place was nearly derelict when he started. He had a vision for what it could become. As the meal progressed, hearty beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that reminded Jackson of his mother's cooking, he learned more about his brother's life in Silver Creek than he'd known in years. Thomas had become a respected businessman, a town council member, even the organizer of the annual Founders' Day celebration. It was as if they were describing a stranger, not the restless young man who had followed Jackson from ranch to ranch in their younger days, never satisfied, always looking toward the next horizon. After dinner, the boarders drifted away to their evening activities, leaving Jackson alone with Lillian in the dining room. She began gathering dishes, and without thinking, he rose to help. "You don't need to do that, Mr. Newell," she said, looking surprised. "Jackson," he corrected. "And I'm not afraid of a little dishwater, Miss Morrison." A smile tugged at her lips. "Lillian, then." She handed him a dish towel. "You can dry." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes before Jackson spoke. "I read some of those letters Thomas wrote, never sent them, though." Lillian glanced at him. "Your brother was a proud man. He wanted to reach out to you, but I think he was waiting until he felt he'd truly accomplished something here. From what I heard tonight, he accomplished plenty." "Yes," she agreed softly, "he did." "The letters mentioned you quite a bit," Jackson said, watching her face carefully. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Did they?" "Said you were the best thing that happened to this place. To him, too, I reckon." Lillian's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Thomas was a dear friend." "We worked well together." "Just friends?" Jackson asked before he could stop himself. Her eyes flashed. "That's quite a personal question from someone who's been in town less than a day, Mr. Newell." "Jackson," he reminded her, "and you're right, forgive me." She nodded, returning to the dishes. After a moment, she added, "Thomas never expressed any deeper feelings, if that's what you're asking. We respected each other as business partners. That was all." Jackson thought of his brother's words, "Never found the courage to tell her how I truly felt, but kept them to himself." It wasn't his place to reveal Thomas's private thoughts, even now. "I still plan to sell," he said instead, "but I'll stay a few days, make sure everything's in order first." Lillian dried her hands on her apron. "That's your right, of course, but I hope you'll at least consider what this place meant to your brother before you do." With that, she bid him good night and left him alone with his thoughts and the lingering scent of lavender that seemed to follow in her wake. The next morning, Jackson rose early, a habit ingrained from years on the range. The town was still quiet as he made his way downstairs, only to find Lillian already at work in the hotel kitchen, kneading bread dough with practiced movements. "You're up with the chickens," she commented, not looking up from her task. "Never could sleep past dawn," he replied, hovering in the doorway. "Coffee made," she nodded toward the stove. "Help yourself, breakfast will be ready in an hour for the guests." Jackson poured himself a cup and after a moment's hesitation asked, "Need any help?" Surprise flickered across her face. "Can you cook, Mr. Newell?" "Jackson," he corrected for what felt like the 10th time, "and I can manage bacon without burning it, usually." A smile, genuine this time, curved her lips. "Then by all means, the bacon's in the icebox. I wouldn't mind the assistance." Working alongside Lillian in the morning quiet, Jackson found himself more at ease than he'd expected. She moved efficiently in the kitchen, and they established a rhythm together, passing utensils and ingredients without needing to ask. By the time the first guests came down for breakfast, they had prepared a respectable spread of bacon, eggs, biscuits, and gravy. "You surprise me," Lillian said as they watched the boarders fill their plates. "I wouldn't have expected a cowboy to be so handy in the kitchen." "A man who can't cook for himself goes hungry on the trail," Jackson replied with a shrug. "Nothing fancy, but I get by." "Well, your biscuits are better than mine," she admitted, "though I'll deny it if you tell anyone." Her smile did something strange to Jackson's insides, a feeling he promptly tried to ignore. He had no business feeling anything for this woman, no matter how capable or pretty she might be. He'd be gone in a few days, back to the life he knew. After breakfast, Lillian suggested they review the hotel's books together. The ledgers revealed a modestly profitable business, one that had steadily grown under Thomas and Lillian's management. The Silvertip wasn't making anyone rich, but it provided a comfortable living and had potential for more. "The town's growing," Lillian explained, pointing to the increasing occupancy rates. "The new silver mine that opened last year has brought in steady business, and the railroad spur line is supposed to reach us by next spring." Jackson studied the neat columns of figures. "You keep a tight ship." Your brother insisted on it. He said he'd seen too many businesses fail from sloppy bookkeeping. "Sounds like Thomas grew up some," Jackson mused. Lillian closed the ledger. People do that, you know, grow, change, find purpose. Her words held a challenge that Jackson didn't miss. Some people are meant for settling, some aren't, he countered. I've known what I am since I was 16. And what's that? A man who needs open sky above him and a horse between his legs, he said simply. Town life would suffocate me faster than a hangman's noose. Something like disappointment flashed in Lillian's eyes. Then you've already decided. Pretty much. He stood, suddenly needing air. Think I'll take a walk around town, see what's changed since I was here last. Lillian nodded, her professional mask slipping back into place. Of course. I have work to attend to anyway. As Jackson stepped out onto Silver Creek's Main Street, he tried to ignore the sense that he'd somehow failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. The town had grown considerably since his last visit years ago. New buildings had sprung up, including a proper courthouse, a bank, and even a small theater. The dusty mining camp was evolving into a real community, one with permanence and ambition. At the general store, the proprietor recognized him immediately. You've got the Newell look about you, the man said, extending his hand. Walter Jenkins, your brother was a regular customer and a friend. Seems everyone in town was Thomas's friend, Jackson observed. Jenkins nodded. He made himself part of this place. Started the reading program at the school with Miss Morrison, organized the bucket brigade when the Mason place caught fire last year. When folks needed help, Thomas stepped up. Again, the image of his brother as a community pillar seemed at odds with the restless young man Jackson remembered. As he continued his walk, more townspeople approached him with similar stories. Thomas fixing the church bell, Thomas organizing the Christmas pageant, Thomas and Miss Morrison establishing the town's first lending library. And in every story, Lillian Morrison's name came up alongside his brother's, the two of them working in tandem to improve Silver Creek. It painted a picture of partnership that went beyond mere business, a shared vision for what this rough-edged town could become. By the time Jackson returned to the hotel in late afternoon, his mind was churning with new impressions. He found Lillian in the small garden behind the kitchen, harvesting vegetables for the evening meal. Need a hand? He asked, approaching the neat rows of plants. She glanced up, shielding her eyes against the sun. If you don't mind getting your hands dirty. Dirt never bothered me none, he replied, kneeling beside her to help pull carrots from the rich soil. They worked in silence for a few minutes before Jackson spoke. Everybody in town seems to think you and Thomas were quite a team. Lillian's hands stilled momentarily. We worked well together, had similar ideas about what Silver Creek could be with a little effort. How'd you end up here anyway? Town this size usually can't keep a schoolteacher long. She smiled ruefully. I came west from Boston 4 years ago, full of idealistic notions about educating frontier children. The reality was somewhat harsher than I'd imagined. When the town couldn't afford my salary anymore, your brother offered me a position here. Her expression softened with the memory. Said my education shouldn't go to waste just because the town council was short-sighted. Sounds like Thomas, Jackson said, though in truth, it didn't sound like the brother he'd known at all. He was a good man, Lillian said quietly. The best I've known. Something in her tone made Jackson glance at her sharply. Perhaps his brother's feelings hadn't been as one-sided as she'd implied. The thought bothered him more than it should have. That evening, after another surprisingly enjoyable supper with the hotel's residents, Jackson found himself once more in Thomas's office, drawn to the bundle of unsent letters. He read deeper into the stack, learning more about his brother's transformation from drifter to businessman, from loner to community member. In one letter, Thomas wrote, I used to think settling down meant giving up freedom, but I've found it's just a different kind of liberty. There's something to be said for having a place that's yours, for being someone people count on. Lillian helped me see that. She's got more courage than 10 men coming out here alone, making her own way. I admire that more than I can say. Jackson set the letter down, troubled. It seemed his brother had found what many men search for their entire lives: purpose, community, and perhaps even love, though unfulfilled. And Jackson had missed it all, too caught up in his own wanderings to notice the changes in Thomas. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Lillian stood in the doorway, a steaming cup in her hands. "I thought you might like some coffee," she said. "You've been in here for hours." Jackson accepted the cup gratefully, "Just trying to understand who my brother became." Lillian leaned against the doorframe, her expression thoughtful. "He spoke of you often, you know, was proud of your skill with horses, your reputation as one of the best trail bosses in Colorado territory." "Funny," Jackson said. "I barely knew what he was doing these past years." "That's the way of brothers sometimes, isn't it?" she replied. "Especially in a place this vast, easy to lose track of each other." "Still," Jackson sighed, "feels like I missed something important." Lillian was quiet for a moment. "It's not too late, you know, to honor what he built here." Jackson met her gaze, noting the challenge there. "By keeping the hotel, by considering it," she corrected. "This place meant everything to him, and," she hesitated, "the town needs it, needs someone to care for it the way Thomas did." "You've been managing just fine," Jackson pointed out. "As an employee, yes, but I don't own it." Without an owner who cares, it could become just another rough establishment, not the respectable place Thomas worked so hard to create. She straightened. "But that's your decision to make. Good night, Jackson." As she turned to leave, Jackson called after her. "Lillian, what if? What if I stayed a few weeks, just to see how things run before making any decisions?" The smile that bloomed on her face made something twist in his chest. "I think that would be wise," she said simply. "Good night." After she left, Jackson stared into the darkness beyond the window, wondering what he was getting himself into. A few weeks in town was already more civilization than he'd endured in years, but somehow the thought didn't panic him the way it once might have. The days that followed settled into an unexpected pattern. Jackson rose early each morning to help with breakfast, then spent the mornings learning the hotel's operations, everything from ordering supplies to handling difficult guests. Afternoons often found him making repairs around the property, skills not so different from those needed on the range. And evenings were passed in the company of Lillian and the hotel's regular boarders, playing cards or simply talking on the wide front porch as the summer evenings cooled. To his surprise, Jackson found himself enjoying the rhythm of hotel life. The satisfaction of fixing a leaky roof or mending a broken stair wasn't so different from the pride he took in completing a successful cattle drive. And the residents of Silver Creek welcomed him warmly, seemingly accepting him as Thomas's natural successor. But it was Lillian's company that increasingly drew him. She was intelligent, well-read but practical, with a quiet humor that caught him off guard. They developed an easy working relationship that gradually extended beyond the hotel's business. She showed him her favorite spots around Silver Creek, the hidden fishing hole in the creek that gave the town its name, the overlook where wildflowers carpeted the hillside, the small bookshop where she indulged her passion for reading. 2 weeks stretched into a month, and Jackson found himself making excuses to delay his decision. The roof needed replacing before winter. The kitchen stove was acting up. The fall hunting season would bring more guests, and Lillian could use the help. But in quiet moments, usually late at night, Jackson would return to Thomas's letters, reading his brother's thoughts, getting to know him posthumously through the words he'd never shared in life. And increasingly, he found himself picking up a pen, writing his own thoughts on paper, sometimes to his long-dead parents, sometimes to Thomas, and occasionally letters to Lillian that he never intended to give her. On a crisp September evening, as the aspen trees began turning golden on the mountainsides, Jackson sat on the hotel's back porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The sound of the door opening made him turn to see Lillian step outside, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the growing autumn chill. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, nodding toward the sunset. "One of the best I've seen," he agreed, shifting to make room for her on the bench. She sat beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she favored. They watched in companionable silence as the colors deepened, then faded to purple and finally the deep blue of twilight. "I've received an offer," Jackson said finally, "for the hotel." Lillian stiffened beside him. "I see. Man from Denver, owns several hotels already, offering a fair price." Her voice was carefully controlled when she responded. And have you decided to accept? Jackson turned to study her profile etched in the fading light. I haven't answered him yet. But you will, she said, not a question but a statement. I don't know, he admitted. A month ago I'd have taken it without hesitation. Now. He trailed off, unsure how to express the conflicting feelings within him. Lillian finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the first evening stars. Now what, Jackson? The sound of his name on her lips still gave him a jolt of pleasure after all these weeks. Now I'm not so sure what I want anymore. Hope flickered across her features before she carefully masked it. The life you described, open skies and horses, that's still waiting for you. It is, he agreed, but I'm finding there are other things worth considering too. Such as, Jackson hesitated, then took a leap he hadn't planned. You for one, Lillian's breath caught audibly. Me, I've come to admire you, Lillian, your strength, your kindness, that sharp mind of yours. He smiled ruefully. It seems the Newell brothers have that in common, at least. Confusion crossed her face. What do you mean? Jackson realized his mistake too late. Nothing, just thinking out loud, but Lillian was too perceptive to let it go. No, you meant something by that, about Thomas. Jackson sighed, knowing he'd backed himself into a corner. I should have kept my mouth shut. Jackson, her tone demanded truth. In his letters, Jackson admitted reluctantly. Thomas wrote about his feelings for you, said he never found the courage to speak them aloud. Lillian's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks visible even in the dimming light. I didn't know. I gathered that, Jackson said, suddenly feeling like an intruder in his brother's private emotions. I shouldn't have mentioned it. Lillian was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. And you, are you speaking of your own feelings or just echoing your brother's? The directness of her question caught Jackson off guard. He began, then faltered. I don't have his way with words. You don't need fancy words, she said softly, just honest ones. Jackson drew a deep breath. I came here planning to settle Thomas's affairs and leave. I never expected to find this. He gestured vaguely between them. Whatever this is, I never expected you. And now. Now I'm writing letters I never thought I'd write, he confessed. Thinking thoughts I never thought I'd think, wondering if maybe there's a life for me that doesn't involve always moving on. Lillian's eyes glistened in the twilight. That sounds an awful lot like hope, Jackson Newell. Maybe it is, he admitted, though it scares me half to death, she laughed softly. The fearless cowboy, afraid of a little hope, terrified, he confirmed with a wry smile. Give me a stampede any day over these feelings. Her hand found his, warm and sure. I've grown fond of you too, you know, more than fond. The simple touch of her fingers intertwined with his scent warmth spreading through Jackson's chest. What about Thomas? He asked, the question that had been troubling him. If you'd known how he felt. Lillian considered this carefully. I loved Thomas as a dear friend. I'm not sure it would have ever been more than that. We worked well together, shared common goals, but she squeezed his hand. It's different with you. There's something between us I never felt with him. Relief washed through Jackson, followed immediately by guilt. Feels disloyal somehow. Thomas would want you to be happy, Lillian said gently. From everything you've told me about him, from everything I knew of him, he wasn't a man to begrudge happiness to those he loved. They sat in silence as full darkness descended, the stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the mountains. Jackson's thoughts raced, possibilities unfolding that he'd never allowed himself to consider before. I still don't know if I can be what this place needs, he finally said. What you might need. I'm not asking you to be Thomas, Lillian replied. Just yourself, that's more than enough. With a courage different from any he'd needed on the range, Jackson turned to face her fully. Lillian Morrison, I think I might be falling in love with you. Her smile in the starlight was answer enough, even before she spoke. I think I might be letting you, Jackson Newell. When their lips met, tentatively at first and then with growing certainty, Jackson knew his life had changed irrevocably. No matter what decision he made about the hotel, about Silver Creek, about his future, nothing would ever be quite the same again. In the weeks that followed, Jackson and Lillian's relationship deepened as autumn painted the Colorado mountains in brilliant gold and crimson. They kept their growing feelings relatively private, though the knowing looks from the hotel's regular boarders suggested they weren't fooling anyone. Jackson still hadn't responded to the offer from the Denver hotelier, letting it hang unanswered as he wrestled with his decision. Each day spent working alongside Lillian at the Silvertip pulled him further from his old life, yet the thought of committing permanently to town life still gave him moments of panic. On a brisk October morning, Jackson sat at Thomas's desk. He still couldn't think of it as his own penning another letter he had no intention of sending. "Dear Thomas," he wrote, "I'm beginning to understand why you started writing these letters. There's something about putting thoughts on paper that helps a man make sense of them. You found your place here in Silver Creek, built something meaningful. I never thought I'd want the same, but Lillian." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Lillian makes me want things I never knew I was missing. A home, a future, maybe even a family someday. It terrifies me even as it draws me in." A knock at the office door startled him, and Jackson quickly folded the letter, tucking it into the desk drawer. Lillian stood in the doorway, her cheeks flushed from the cold outside. "There you are," she said with a smile that still made his heart skip. "I've been looking everywhere. The Hendersons just arrived from Denver and need help with their trunks." Jackson rose, grateful for the interruption. "More city folks looking to experience authentic frontier living while sleeping on feather mattresses?" he asked with a wry smile. Lillian laughed. "Something like that, though Mrs. Henderson seems determined to catch a glimpse of real Indians before they return east." "Should we tell her most of the Ute in these parts are on the reservation now?" Jackson asked as they walked toward the lobby. "And ruin her Wild West adventure? That would be unkind," Lillian teased, her eyes sparkling. As they greeted the new guests, a prosperous-looking couple in their 50s, dressed in expensive but impractical clothing for the mountains, Jackson found himself falling easily into the role of hotel proprietor. He answered questions about local attractions, recommended the best places to eat in town, and arranged for a local guide to take them fishing the next day. "You're becoming quite the hotelier," Lillian murmured as the Hendersons headed upstairs to settle in. "Don't sound so surprised," Jackson replied with mock offense. "I can be civilized when required." "Indeed you can," she agreed, smoothing the lapel of his jacket, a new purchase, as his trail clothes had begun to look out of place behind the reception desk. "The question is whether you want to be." Before Jackson could respond, the hotel's front door burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and a trail-worn cowboy who Jackson recognized immediately. "Mitch," he exclaimed, stepping forward to greet his foreman with a handshake. "What brings you to Silver Creek?" Mitch Peterson removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Lillian before answering. "Looking for you, boss. Drive's finished, cattle delivered to Kansas City. Boys are wondering if you're coming back for the winter work or if they should look elsewhere." The question hung in the air, suddenly making real the decision Jackson had been avoiding for weeks. Lillian's expression remained carefully neutral, but he could feel the weight of her attention. "I haven't decided yet," Jackson said finally, "still settling my brother's affairs." Mitch glanced around the hotel lobby with its polished floors and tasteful furnishings. "Looks like a mighty comfortable place to spend the winter, that's for sure. Better than bunkhouse living." "We have a room available if you'd like to stay the night," Lillian offered. "Any friend of Jackson's is welcome here." "Much obliged, madam," Mitch replied with a tip of his hat. "Been a long ride from the ranch." As Lillian showed Mitch to a room, Jackson found himself staring out the window at the mountains, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. Winter in the high country was harsh, and ranching work during those months was some of the hardest, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling feed through snowdrifts, losing cattle to cold and predators despite your best efforts. Yet it was the life he knew, the rhythm he'd followed for more than a decade. The thought of abandoning it completely left him feeling unmoored, as if he might lose some essential part of himself in the process. That evening, after a hearty supper where Mitch regaled the boarders with stories of the cattle drive, Jackson found himself walking with Lillian in the crisp night air. They strolled through town, their breath forming clouds in the moonlight as they made their way to the small bridge that crossed Silver Creek. "Your foreman seems to think you'll be returning to the ranch," Lillian said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Jackson leaned against the bridge railing, watching the dark water flow beneath them. Mitch knows the ranch needs a trail boss for next season, and you need to decide if that trail boss will be you, she finished for him. It's what I know, Jackson said simply. What I'm good at. Lillian turned to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight. You're good at many things, Jackson. I've seen that these past months. The question isn't what you're good at, but what makes you happy. That used to be an easy answer, he admitted. Open country, good horses, work that tested a man's mettle. And now, Jackson studied her face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the determination in her eyes. Now there's you, he said softly. And this place, and I'm torn between two worlds in a way I never expected to be. Lillian stepped closer, placing her hand over his on the railing. I won't ask you to be someone you're not, she said. I fell in love with Jackson Newell, not some imagined version of you. The words fell in love hung in the air between them, the first time either had spoken them so plainly. Jackson's heart hammered in his chest as he realized the depth of what they were discussing, not just his decision about the hotel, but their future together. I love you, Lillian, he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. I think I have since that first day, though I was too stubborn to admit it. Her smile was radiant even in the dim light. And I love you, which is why I need to be honest with you now. Jackson tensed, uncertain what was coming. If you sell the hotel and return to ranching full-time, I won't go with you, she said, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. I've built a life here in Silver Creek. I belong here in a way I never belonged in Boston or anywhere else. I won't leave. The certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. Jackson nodded slowly, understanding completely. Lillian Morrison was rooted to this place as surely as the mountains themselves. And if I stay, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Then we see where this love takes us, she replied simply. Together. Jackson pulled her to him then, kissing her with all the conflicting emotions swirling within him: desire, uncertainty, hope, fear. She met his intensity with her own, her arms encircling his neck as they stood suspended in the moment, the decision still unmade but the feelings between them unmistakable. When they finally parted, breathless in the cold mountain air, Jackson pressed his forehead to hers. I need a little more time, he said, to be sure. I understand, she replied, though he could hear the cost of her patience in her voice. Just don't wait too long, Cowboy. Some decisions don't keep. The following morning, Jackson rode out with Mitch, ostensibly to show his foreman some of the countryside around Silver Creek, but in reality seeking the clarity that only came to him on horseback. They climbed high above the town, following game trails through aspen groves until they reached a windswept ridge overlooking the valley. Quite a view, Mitch commented as they dismounted to rest the horses. Man could get used to waking up to that. Jackson nodded, surveying the patchwork of ranches, the silver ribbon of creek, and the cluster of buildings that made up Silver Creek. From this distance, the Silvertip Hotel was just another structure, indistinguishable from the others. But Jackson knew exactly which one it was, could picture Lillian moving efficiently through its rooms, managing the business with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. What would you do, Mitch? He asked suddenly. If you found someone that made you question everything you thought you wanted, Mitch chewed thoughtfully on a piece of grass before answering. Reckon that depends on how much questioning you're doing. Some men aren't cut out for settling. Others just think they aren't because they never found a good enough reason to try. And which am I? Mitch laughed. That's for you to figure out, boss. But I will say this, in all the years I've known you, I've never seen you look at open country the way you look at that schoolteacher of yours. Jackson couldn't deny it. She won't leave Silver Creek. Then that simplifies things, doesn't it? Mitch said pragmatically. Either you stay or you lose her. And the ranch, the drives, Mitch shrugged. Ranch will be there. Might be you could do both in a fashion. Hire a foreman to manage year-round, join the drives seasonally. Wouldn't be the first rancher to have other business interests. The idea struck Jackson with the force of revelation. He'd been thinking in absolutes: cowboy or hotelier, freedom or settlement, when perhaps there was a middle path he hadn't considered. You think the men would respect an owner who only showed up for the drives? He asked skeptically. If that owner was Jackson Newell? Yes, sir, I do, Mitch grinned. Besides, most of those boys are sweet on that cook of yours. They'd follow you just for another taste of his apple pie. As they rode back to town, a plan began forming in Jackson's mind, one that might allow him to keep the parts of his old life he treasured while building something new with Lillian. It would require compromise, adaptation, but perhaps that was what growing meant. Perhaps that was what Thomas had discovered in his own journey from drifter to community pillar. When they reached the hotel, Jackson found Lillian in the kitchen garden, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables before the hard freeze that was surely coming. She looked up at his approach, uncertainty flickering across her features. "Could we talk?" he asked. Privately, she nodded, brushing soil from her hands as she followed him to the small gazebo Thomas had built at the garden's edge. Once they were seated, Jackson took both her hands in his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "I've made my decision," he said. Lillian's grip tightened on his hands, but she remained silent, waiting. "I'm keeping the hotel," Jackson continued, "and I'm staying in Silver Creek." Joy bloomed in her eyes, though she tried to contain it. "Are you certain? I don't want you to resent me or this place later." "I'm certain about you," he said firmly. "The rest, well, I have an idea about that. I'm thinking I could hire Mitch to manage the ranch year-round but join the cattle drive seasonally. Maybe 2 months in spring, 2 in fall. That would give me the open sky I need while still making this place and you my home." Lillian studied him, searching his expression. 4 months apart each year," she said slowly. "That's a significant sacrifice for both of us." "It is," he agreed, "but it might be the right balance, at least to start. I need some connection to that life, Lillian. It's shaped me too deeply to abandon completely." She nodded thoughtfully. "And the hotel, who would manage it during those months?" "You would," Jackson said simply. "You already know the business as well as I do, better, in fact. We'd be partners, just as you were with Thomas." "Partners," she repeated, a smile tugging at her lips. "Is that all you're proposing, Mr. Newell?" Jackson felt heat rise in his cheeks. "For now, but if you're amenable, I'd like to court you properly, and perhaps if things continue as they have been between us." He faltered, suddenly nervous. Lillian's smile widened. "Yes." "I might ask you a more significant question," he finished. "Someday, when we're both ready." She reached up to cup his cheek, her eyes shining. "I think I'd like that very much, Jackson." He turned his head to kiss her palm. "So we have an agreement. You'll tolerate a part-time cowboy as your partner in business and other matters?" "I will," she said softly, "on one condition." "Name it." "Write to me," she said. "When you're away on the drives, I want to know your thoughts, your experiences, everything." Jackson laughed, the sound full of newfound joy. "You're asking a man who never wrote letters to become a regular correspondent?" "I've seen the letters you've been writing," she admitted, "the ones in your desk drawer." Jackson's surprise must have shown on his face because she quickly added, "I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the property tax records and found them by accident. I only read the first few lines before I realized they were personal." "They were meant for you," he confessed. "Though I never intended for you to see them." "Why not?" Jackson shrugged, embarrassed. "They're not very good. I'm no writer. They're perfect because they're yours," she insisted. "Your brother found his voice through letters he never sent. Perhaps you can find yours in letters you do." The idea appealed to him more than he expected. "You'll write back. Every day you're gone," she promised. Jackson pulled her close then, sealing their agreement with a kiss that felt like a beginning. As he held her in the fading autumn light, he thought of Thomas and the path his brother had blazed, a path Jackson had never understood until now. The letters that had initially confused him had become a bridge, not just to his brother's memory, but to his own future. When they finally separated, Jackson kept his arm around Lillian's shoulders as they walked back toward the hotel, their hotel now, truly. The thought no longer frightened him as it once had. Instead, it felt right, as if he'd been moving toward this moment his entire life without realizing it. That evening, Jackson sat at his brother's desk, his desk now, and began a new letter. But unlike the others, this one had a destination. "Dear Mitch," he wrote, "please inform the men that I'll be joining the spring drive as planned, but with some changes to our usual arrangements." By the time winter blanketed Silver Creek in deep snow, Jackson and Lillian had settled into a comfortable routine at the Silvertip. The hotel remained full despite the season, as miners, drummers, and the occasional tourist passed through. Together, they made improvements Thomas had planned but never implemented, expanding the dining room, adding a small lending library for guests, and renovating the largest suite to attract wealthier clientele. Their courtship progressed with a blend of old-fashioned propriety and moments of passion stolen in quiet corners of the hotel. The boarders watched their romance with benevolent interest, offering advice both welcomed and unsolicited. Jackson found himself unexpectedly embraced by the community Thomas had loved, invited to join the town council and help organize the winter festival. On Christmas Eve, with the hotel decorated with pine boughs and ribbon, the lobby filled with townspeople for the annual Christmas party Thomas had apparently started years earlier. Jackson stood near the punch bowl, watching Lillian move through the crowd, her green dress setting off the auburn highlights in her hair. She caught his eye across the room and smiled, a private look meant only for him. Later, after the last guests had departed and the boarders had retired to their rooms, Jackson and Lillian sat before the dying fire in the lobby, enjoying a moment of quiet after the festivities. "Thomas would have loved tonight," Lillian said, her head resting against Jackson's shoulder. "He always said Christmas brought out the best in people." "I think he was right," Jackson agreed, reaching into his pocket, "which is why I wanted to give you this tonight rather than waiting for morning." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Lillian sat up, her eyes bright with surprise as she carefully unwrapped it. Inside lay a small leather-bound book, its cover embossed with her initials. "Open it," Jackson urged softly. Lillian did, finding the pages filled with Jackson's distinctive handwriting, not the careful script he used for hotel business, but the rushed, slightly uneven hand of his personal thoughts. "These are all the letters I wrote to you," he explained, suddenly nervous, "from the very beginning. I thought you might want them, even though they were never meant to be sent." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes as she gently touched the pages. "Jackson, this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received." "There's something else," he said, his heart pounding. "On the last page." Lillian turned to the final entry, dated that very day. As she read, her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening. "Dear Lillian," Jackson had written, "a year ago, I would have laughed if anyone told me I'd be writing love letters or running a hotel or thinking about forever with a woman who challenges and completes me in ways I never imagined possible. A year ago, I was half the man I am now, though I didn't know it then. Thomas found his purpose in Silver Creek, in this hotel, in the community he helped build, and now I've found mine not just in this place but in you, in the life we're creating together. So I'm asking, with all the hope and love a former drifter can muster, will you marry me? Will you be my partner in all things, not just in business? Will you help me continue what Thomas started but make it uniquely ours? I'll understand if you need time to consider, or if 4 months apart each year seems too great a sacrifice. But know that whatever your answer, you've changed me irrevocably. You've taught a cowboy who never wrote letters to fill pages with his heart. Forever yours, Jackson." Lillian looked up from the page, tears streaming freely now. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes to everything." Jackson pulled a small velvet box from his other pocket, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Thomas had it all these years. Left it for me in his personal effects with a note saying I should give it to a woman worthy of it, as if he knew somehow that I'd find you here." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Jackson felt a sense of rightness, of completion. The wandering cowboy who had arrived in Silver Creek months ago, intent on selling his inheritance and returning to the range, had found something he'd never known he was searching for. "I love you, Jackson Newell," Lillian said, framing his face with her hands. "Cowboy, hotelier, letter writer, all of you." "And I love you, Lillian Morrison," he replied. "Soon to be Lillian Newell, if you're agreeable." Her answer was a kiss that promised a lifetime of togetherness, of compromise and adventure, of love that bridged different worlds. They were married in the spring, just before Jackson departed for his first cattle drive as a married man. The ceremony in Silver Creek's small church was attended by the entire town, along with the ranch hands who had come to escort their boss back to the range. 2 months, Jackson reminded Lillian as they stood at the edge of town, his horse saddled and ready, the cattle drive assembled beyond. "I'll be back before you know it." "I'll hold you to that," she replied, straightening his bandana, "and expect a letter at least once a week." "Twice," he promised, "and I expect the same." As Jackson rode out with the herd, he carried Lillian's first letter in his breast pocket, already treasuring the connection it represented. The open sky above him still sang with the freedom he'd always loved, but now it was accompanied by the anticipation of return, of coming home to the woman who had taught a cowboy to write his heart on paper. Over the years that followed, Jackson kept his promise, joining the cattle drives in spring and fall while building the Silvertip Hotel into one of the finest establishments in Colorado with Lillian at his side. Their partnership flourished in business and in life, each complementing the other's strengths. They expanded the hotel, adding a proper restaurant that became known throughout the territory for its excellent food. They established a stagecoach stop that brought regular traffic, and when the railroad finally reached Silver Creek in 1882, the Silvertip was ready to welcome the influx of visitors. Their letters to each other during Jackson's absences became legendary among their friends' packets that arrived weekly, filled with daily observations, declarations of love, and plans for the future. Jackson discovered a talent for vivid description, capturing the beauty of the range and the adventures of the drive in words that Lillian cherished and collected. In 1878, their first child was born, a son they named Thomas, in honor of the man who had inadvertently brought them together. 2 years later, a daughter named Sarah joined their family, followed by another son, William, in 1882. The children grew up in the hotel, learning both the hospitality business from their mother and horsemanship from their father. By 1886, 10 years after Jackson had ridden into Silver Creek to claim his brother's legacy, the Silvertip Hotel stood as a testament to what love and dedication could build. Jackson's seasonal absences had shortened over the years as the hotel demanded more of his attention, and as Mitch proved increasingly capable of managing the ranch operations. Now he joined the drives for just a month each season, more out of love for the tradition than necessity. On a warm summer evening, as they sat on the same back porch where they had first acknowledged their feelings a decade earlier, Jackson and Lillian watched their children playing in the garden Thomas had planted and they had expanded. "Do you ever regret it?" Lillian asked, her hand clasped in his. Settling down, giving up the full freedom of the range, Jackson considered the question seriously, as was his way. At 42, his face was more lined than when he'd arrived in Silver Creek, his hair touched with gray at the temples. But his eyes were clearer, more at peace than they'd ever been in his wandering days. "Not for a moment," he answered truthfully. "I found more freedom in staying than I ever had in leaving." Lillian smiled, the years having only enhanced her beauty in his eyes. "Your brother would be proud of what we've built here." "He would," Jackson agreed, "though I think he'd be even more proud that I finally learned to write a decent letter." Lillian laughed, the sound still as captivating as the first time he'd heard it. "You've filled more pages than either of us ever expected." As the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, Jackson pulled his wife closer, thinking of the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. He had come to Silver Creek seeking only to settle his brother's affairs, to tie up loose ends before returning to the life he knew. Instead, he had found a beginning, a love story written not just in the letters he'd learned to write, but in the life he and Lillian had built together. "I love you, Mrs. Newell," he said softly, the words as true now as the first time he'd spoken them. "And I love you, my letter-writing cowboy," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder as their children's laughter filled the evening air, the sweetest punctuation to the story that had started with a cowboy who never wrote letters, until a woman left, and he started filling pages with his heart.